Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because stories like this rarely unfold the way we expect them to. What you're about to hear isn't a headline recap or a surface-level celebrity profile. It's a slow, uncomfortable look at how even the most stable public figures can shift in ways that leave everyone unsettled. Something has changed around Keith Urban, and it hasn't happened loudly or dramatically. It's been subtle, quiet, and deeply unsettling to the people closest to him. Fans feel it too, even if they can't quite explain why. For decades, Keith Urban was country music's safest constant, dependable, polished, charming, emotionally controlled. He was the man who survived addiction, rebuilt his life, and became a symbol of redemption done right. But recently, that image has started to fracture. Not with scandal or relapse, but with distance, decisions, and emotional weight that no one expected from him. Keith Urban isn't collapsing, but he's no longer the man the world thought it knew, and the truth behind that shift is far heavier than most people are prepared to accept. Keith Urban's transformation didn't begin in 2025, and it certainly didn't begin with headlines about his personal life. To understand what's happening now, you have to go back to a childhood shaped almost entirely by urgency and expectation. Music wasn't a hobby for Keith. It was an identity imposed early and embraced fully. At just 4 years old, his parents placed a ukulele in his hands, unknowingly setting the trajectory for the rest of his life. By 5, after seeing Johnny Cash perform live, Keith wasn't just inspired, he was convinced. That night didn't plant a dream, it carved a demand into his psyche. Growing up in Brisbane, music wasn't background noise in his home. It was oxygen. His father's love for country music filled every room, every drive, every quiet moment. By 7, Keith had a guitar. By 14, he was performing publicly. And by 15, he walked away from school entirely. Childhood, normal adolescence, experimentation, all of it was sacrificed for a single, unrelenting belief. Music was not a choice. It was survival. That level of early commitment came with consequences Keith wouldn't fully understand until decades later. At just 9 years old, he stepped onto national television on an Australian talent show, expecting validation, and received dismissal instead. Judge Barnard King openly criticized country music itself, reducing Keith's passion to something mediocre and disposable. For a child, that kind of rejection doesn't fade. It embeds. Keith clung desperately to the one neutral word the judge used, reframing it as a compliment because he had no other emotional option. His mother tried to soften the blow, explaining that being intrinsic meant he was a natural musician. But damage doesn't require cruelty to take hold, indifference is often enough. At 16, he tried again on another talent show, performing an Air Supply song with everything he had. He failed again. These weren't just losses, they were lessons. They taught Keith that approval was conditional, fleeting, and something that could vanish without warning. Long before addiction entered his life, insecurity had already made itself comfortable. By the early 1990s, Keith Urban had achieved enough success in Australia to convince himself it was time for the ultimate gamble. In 1992, he left everything familiar behind and moved to Nashville, the city he believed would finally recognize his worth. What he found instead was isolation. Nashville wasn't waiting for him. It didn't care about his sacrifices or his talent. He lived out of a battered van with his band, The Ranch, playing empty rooms to indifferent audiences. Some nights there were 3 people watching, sometimes fewer. The industry didn't nurture him. It tested his endurance. When The Ranch dissolved after their 1997 album, Keith was left alone with disappointment and a creeping sense of failure. This was the moment when something darker entered his life quietly and without ceremony. Nashville didn't just give him opportunity. It introduced him to cocaine. Not as a dramatic downfall, but as a coping mechanism. A way to dull loneliness, pressure, and the fear that he had already peaked before anyone truly noticed him. By the early 2000s, Keith Urban finally broke through in a way that felt permanent. His albums climbed the charts, critics praised his songwriting, and the industry embraced him as a fresh, emotionally intelligent voice in country music. To the public, he was effortless, charming, soft-spoken, in control. But fame didn't heal the damage underneath. His first rehab stay in 1998 interrupted his addiction, but it didn't resolve it. The deeper issues remained untouched: the childhood pressure, the fear of inadequacy, the loneliness that followed him even into crowded rooms. Keith learned how to perform stability without actually living it. Every success raised the stakes higher. Every expectation tightened the emotional noose. The world believed he had conquered his demons. In reality, he had simply learned how to hide them better. Addiction doesn't disappear when applause gets louder. It waits, patient and silent, for the moment when pressure outweighs restraint. Everything seemed to change in 2005 when Keith Urban met Nicole Kidman at the G-Day USA Gala in Los Angeles. Their connection wasn't strategic or manufactured. It was immediate, deep, and disarming. Nicole wasn't just famous. She was emotionally grounded, reflective, and quietly strong. For Keith, she represented something he had never fully trusted before: safety. Their relationship moved quickly, not recklessly, but with a sense of inevitability. By June 2006, they were married in Sydney in a ceremony that felt both glamorous and sincere. To the outside world, it looked like a fairy tale. To Keith, it felt like redemption. He believed love could finally outrun his past, but addiction doesn't negotiate. 4 months into the marriage, Keith relapsed. Alcohol returned. Cocaine followed. The collapse wasn't explosive, it was insidious. For the first time, he wasn't unraveling alone. He was unraveling in front of the person he loved most. Nicole noticed what Keith tried desperately to conceal: the emotional distance, the familiar patterns, the quiet chaos behind closed doors. Instead of waiting for catastrophe, she intervened calmly, deliberately, without spectacle. She gathered a small circle of people Keith trusted and staged an intervention rooted not in anger, but in boundaries. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was a lifeline. Keith later admitted that moment forced him to confront a truth he had avoided for decades. Love could not save him unless he chose to save himself. In October 2006, he entered the Betty Ford Center, stepping away from fame, canceling appearances, and facing himself without distraction. This wasn't a public relations move. It was survival. When he emerged in January 2007, sober and stripped of illusion, Keith understood that recovery wasn't a phase. It was a lifelong discipline, one that would demand honesty even when it hurt. After rehab, Keith Urban rebuilt his life with an almost surgical precision. Sobriety became the framework around which everything else existed. His music shifted first. Albums released after 2007 weren't louder or flashier, they were heavier, more reflective, less concerned with approval. He blended genres, challenged tradition, and allowed vulnerability into his songwriting in ways he never had before. But stability came at a cost. Sobriety didn't erase pressure, it amplified awareness of it. Keith became hyper-disciplined, constantly working, constantly moving. Tour, television, residencies, albums, stillness felt dangerous. He had learned that silence was where old thoughts resurfaced. To the public, he looked healthier than ever. Internally, he was managing a constant balancing act between control and collapse. Keith's role on The Voice Australia and later American Idol revealed a different side of him. He wasn't performative. He was present. Contestants gravitated toward him because he didn't posture. He understood failure intimately. That authenticity wasn't accidental, it was earned. Television didn't elevate his fame, it exposed his humanity. But being emotionally available on demand is exhausting. Over time, the expectation that Keith would always be calm, kind, and grounded became another unspoken burden. Even growth can become a cage when the world refuses to let you evolve beyond it. Fame never stopped watching Keith Urban, and eventually it wore him down. The paparazzi incident involving Nicole in 2013 wasn't just frightening, it was symbolic. It reinforced how little control he truly had over his private life. From that moment on, Keith became more guarded. Interviews shortened, boundaries sharpened. The warmth remained, but it was protected. The world mistook this for maturity. In reality, it was survival. Protecting his family meant retreating emotionally, a choice that, over time, isolates even the strongest partnerships. Keith responded to pressure the only way he knew how: by working harder. Non-stop touring, creative reinvention, Las Vegas residencies. He said yes to everything because stopping meant listening to thoughts he had avoided his entire life. The discipline that once saved him began to exhaust him. Resilience has limits. Healing does too. No one noticed because he never collapsed. He just tightened inward. By 2024, subtle changes became harder to ignore. Interviews felt restrained. Decisions came abruptly. Patience wore thin. People close to him sensed unrest but couldn't name it. Keith wasn't angry, he was tired. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. The kind that comes from decades of being strong for everyone else. In early 2025, Keith abruptly fired multiple longtime band members, some of whom had been with him for over 25 years. There was no explanation, no public gratitude. For fans and insiders, it was shocking. This wasn't a business move. It was emotional. A search for control when other parts of his life felt untethered. Then came the quiet implosion of his marriage. After 19 years, Keith and Nicole separated. Reports suggested Nicole wanted to save it. Keith didn't. There were no joint statements, no emotional interviews, just silence. For a relationship that once symbolized redemption, the ending felt cold. Final, unrecognizable. Keith began altering lyrics in songs written for Nicole, not subtly, not playfully. Audiences noticed. The changes felt pointed, detached, unresolved. Fans weren't witnessing reinvention. They were watching someone process loss in real time, without clarity or closure. This wasn't relapse. It wasn't scandal. It was reckoning, a man confronting who he is when the roles fall away. Husband, savior, survivor, mentor. Keith Urban had outlived every version of himself and now stood without a map. Keith didn't spiral outward. He unraveled inward. Quietly. Controlled. The most dangerous kind of exhaustion is the one that doesn't ask for help. It convinces you that endurance is enough. For a boy who chased perfection at 7, adulthood became a lifelong performance of strength. But strength without rest becomes fracture. Healing without pause becomes hollow. Keith Urban's story isn't finished. Transformation rarely announces itself. It leaks. It reshapes. It leaves people uncomfortable because it refuses to fit a narrative. What happens next is unknown. But one thing is certain, the Keith Urban we're watching now is not the same man who survived addiction, rebuilt his life, and stood as a symbol of stability. This is something else. Something unresolved. What do you think was the biggest turning point in his story? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that dig deeper than the headlines.